The millionaire's daughter was born paralyzed until a poor boy discovered a shocking truth. The night sea off the coast of Maine held its breath in silence. Waves lapped softly. The salty wind slipped through the half-open window, brushing against the white curtains that swayed as if breathing. At the end of the cobblestone road stood Ethan Cole's house, a large mansion with pale gray walls and roof tiles silvered by sea mist. From the outside, it looked perfect, but inside, everything was steeped in silence and emptiness. Ethan had once been a famous architect, a man who designed buildings filled with light and open space, believing that light could heal people. But since the day his wife, Rachel, died during childbirth, the light in his life had gone out. Their only daughter, Lila, was born in absolute silence, no cry, no movement. The doctors called it total motor nerve paralysis, a condition so rare that no one could predict what would happen. Ethan took his daughter everywhere, meeting the best specialists, trying every possible treatment: physical therapy, neural stimulation, experimental drugs. He sold his company, abandoned all projects, and devoted his entire life to a single purpose: to help his daughter move, even once. Years passed, yet Lila remained motionless. Her eyes, wide and pale blue like a winter sky, stared blankly into space. Ethan refused to surrender. He turned his home into a private hospital: white walls, modern machines, a rotating team of nurses. The sound of monitors replaced laughter. The smell of disinfectant replaced the scent of sea flowers. Each morning, Ethan sat beside his daughter's bed and told her stories about the sky, about her mother, about the buildings he once designed. He would say, "You know, your mother loved the sea. She used to say that light dancing on the water looked like souls celebrating." Lila never replied, only gazed at the ceiling. Still, Ethan kept talking, day after day. Sometimes he told fairy tales. Sometimes he just held her hand in silence and hummed softly. There was never any reaction, but he kept hoping. At night, he would walk down the hallway, glance into the sterile rooms, and feel as if he were living inside a tomb wrapped in technology. He had money, everything science could offer, yet he could not reach the soul of his own child. Each beep of the monitor echoed like the ticking of time, slow, cold, and merciless. And in that house by the sea, between bright white walls and bottomless despair, Ethan stayed awake every night, praying for a miracle he no longer knew whether to believe in. That morning the sky was pale gray, the sea rippled gently, and the wind carried a misty breeze through the quiet garden in front of Ethan's seaside house. He had just finished Lila's routine medical check when the doorbell rang, a rare sound that shattered the silence which had ruled this place for years. At the gate stood Maya Thompson, a woman in her early 30s, small in stature, with a thin face but strong, determined eyes. Beside her was Noah, a 9-year-old boy with bright brown eyes and a worn-out backpack. Maya spoke softly but firmly. "I heard you're looking for a full-time housekeeper. I have experience taking care of patients. All I need is a place to stay and steady work." Ethan nodded, his voice rough from years of not speaking to strangers. "You can start right away." He didn't ask many questions. He didn't care about their past. To him, everyone who came eventually left. He only needed someone to keep the house orderly and quiet. Maya and Noah moved into the small cottage behind the garden. It was a modest place with old white walls, but to them it was the beginning of something new. On her first day, Maya moved quietly, almost soundless. She cleaned carefully, replaced the wilted flowers, and opened the windows to let sunlight pour in. Ethan watched her from afar, silently. He wasn't used to anyone else's presence besides the hum of machines. Noah, however, was nothing like his mother. The boy was curious about everything. Barefoot, he wandered through the grass, gazing up at the tall windows and long hallways. He asked, "Mom, why is this house so big, but so quiet?" Maya smiled faintly, a sadness in her eyes. "Maybe places with too much sorrow have little sound, my love." That afternoon, while Maya was cleaning the living room, Noah wandered toward the east corridor, where the golden light of dusk slanted through the glass panels. There he saw Lila, lying on a special bed in a white room. No one spoke. The boy stood at the doorway, eyes wide. Before him was a girl about his age, her pale blonde hair spread across the pillow, her blue eyes open but frozen, like a sky turned to ice. Noah didn't ask his mother or Ethan what was wrong with her. He simply sat down on the floor, opened his backpack, took out a stack of paper and a box of colored pencils. Then he began to draw. Clouds, a small boat, a setting sun. The room, once filled only with the sound of medical devices, now had a new sound, the soft scratch of pencils on paper. Noah didn't look directly at Lila, but he didn't ignore her either. He just stayed there, naturally, as if her silence didn't frighten him. When Maya found him, she froze. "Noah, you shouldn't be in this room." The boy looked up and smiled. "I'm just drawing, Mom. She doesn't look sad at all." Ethan appeared at the doorway. He was about to scold the boy, but stopped. The sight before him, a child sitting cross-legged, drawing in the quiet room, sunlight brushing through his hair, suddenly softened something inside him. For the first time in a long while, the air in that house didn't feel so heavy. That night, as Ethan sat at his desk reading Lila's medical reports, he found himself listening to a faint sound drifting from the small house in the garden. A child's laughter, light and clear. That laughter, thin as a thread, began to stitch together the first crack in his heart. From that very first day, Noah began coming to Lila's white room every afternoon. He didn't speak much. He would simply sit down on the floor, open his sketchbook, and start to draw. Sometimes it was a bird in flight, sometimes a small house by the sea, sometimes the very room itself, with the silent girl bathed in soft sunlight. Lila never turned her head, but at times her eyes moved slightly, following the colors he drew. It was something no one had ever seen before. Noah didn't notice it right away, but Maya did. Once, while standing at the doorway, she noticed that Lila's eyes were no longer entirely empty. There seemed to be a faint glimmer of light whenever Noah smiled. Maya didn't dare speak of it, afraid that if anyone tried to explain it, the magic would disappear. Days passed, and Noah kept coming. He talked to Lila as though she could understand everything. "Lila, today I saw a seagull. It flew so low I thought I could almost touch it. Do you like birds?" There was no reply, only the sunlight reflected in her wide-open eyes. But Noah wasn't discouraged. He kept talking, kept smiling, kept drawing. He began bringing with him little things he loved, a heart-shaped stone, a shell with a tiny hole, a small snail shell that whistled in the wind. He placed them on the table beside Lila and whispered, "This is a gift. If you want to keep it, just look at it. I'll know." Ethan, standing silently in the hallway, watched them. He didn't understand what was happening. The boy, whom he had once considered a nuisance, was doing something that an entire team of doctors could not, bringing life back into that room. One afternoon, Noah decided to read a story. He took an old book from his backpack, sat on the floor, and began to read aloud. His clear, young voice filled the quiet room, mingling with the distant sound of waves beyond the window. After each page, he looked up at Lila, as if waiting for a reaction, though he knew there would be none. But then, on the final page, he noticed something. Her eyelashes trembled. Noah stopped reading and said softly, "Can you hear me?" There was no reply, but her eyes seemed gentler somehow. From that day on, Noah brought a book every afternoon. Sometimes he told funny stories, sometimes he just hummed songs. Though Lila remained silent, the air around her no longer felt lifeless. Maya realized that her son had become an inseparable part of this house. She noticed Ethan looking at Noah differently, no longer with suspicion, but with quiet gratitude. One night, after everyone had gone to bed, Ethan stood on the porch in the darkness, gazing through the window of his daughter's room. The small bedside lamp cast light over two figures, a motionless girl and a boy, sitting beside her, drawing. There were no words, no visible miracles. But for the first time in many years, Ethan felt that something was changing, not in Lila's body, but in her soul. One summer noon, the sunlight poured gold across the sea. The air was heavy with heat, and the wind was barely enough to stir a few leaves on the trees by the porch. Ethan was speaking with the nurse inside the room, while Maya was hanging towels to dry in the garden. Only Noah was near the swimming pool, playing with a red rubber ball. By the window, Lila had been brought outside to breathe some fresh air. She lay on her special chair, her pale blonde hair slightly tousled in the sun. The light reflected off the water, and in her eyes something flickered, a fragile spark of life breaking through a long sleep. Noah threw the ball. It bounced, then rolled toward her. He ran after it and stopped. He noticed that Lila's gaze was fixed on the pool, not distant as usual, but focused, deliberate. He leaned closer and asked softly, "Do you like the water?" Of course, there was no reply, but he felt something, a faint instinct, a pull. He went behind her chair, gripped the handles, and began to push gently. The wheels scraped against the stone tiles, echoing in the still air. Noah pushed Lila closer to the pool's edge. The surface of the water reflected her face, shimmering with light. He looked around. No one was there. And then, in a brief moment, without thought, Noah pushed harder. The chair slid forward, tilted, and together with Lila, plunged into the pool with a loud splash. Maya's scream tore through the air. Ethan burst out of the house, his heart nearly stopping. The sight before them froze everyone in place. The chair was sinking, but Lila was not. She floated to the surface, her body trembling. Her thin arms began to move, at first barely, then more clearly. Her fingers trembled, reaching for the air. Her eyes widened, the world rushing into her lungs. Then, from the depth of her silence, a sound broke free, fragile but alive. Noah immediately jumped into the water, swimming toward her, terrified yet amazed. "Lila, are you okay?" She didn't answer. Water streamed down her face, her lips quivering, and tears began to fall, not from fear, but from the shock of feeling everything so vividly, the cold, the wet, the living. Maya ran to the pool's edge, trembling, shouting her name. Ethan stopped, unable to believe his eyes. Before him, his daughter was moving. They pulled Lila out, wrapping her in dry towels. She shivered violently, but her eyes were glowing, scanning the world as if seeing it for the very first time. Ethan knelt beside her, his hands trembling as he touched hers. "Lila, can you hear me?" She didn't answer, only looked straight at him, her eyes no longer empty. In that moment, their gazes met after years of silence, and Ethan broke down in tears. Noah stood still, water dripping from his hair onto his shoulders. He feared he would be scolded, but no one spoke. The silence was filled with awe and emotion. Maya knelt beside them, gently wiping the water from the girl's cheeks. Lila kept staring, her lips quivering as if trying to form words, but only a faint sound came out. Ethan clutched her hand tightly, crying like a child. No one understood what had just happened. They only knew that the impossible had become real. From that day on, the whole house changed. Lila began blinking in response to sounds, turning her head slightly toward Noah's voice. And every time he laughed, her lips curved faintly, the ghost of a smile returning to life. After that day, Ethan's seaside house was never the same again. The heavy air and the steady beeping of machines were replaced by something new. Waiting? A different kind of silence. the silence of hope. Lila began to respond more clearly. Every morning, when Noah entered the room, her eyes would move immediately, following his footsteps. When he smiled, her lips trembled, as if trying to smile back. Noah kept coming every day, bringing with him the smallest pieces of the outside world: seashells, colored pencils, pine cones, a tiny bell, and especially a yellow rubber duck he had found in Ethan's old storage room. He sat down on the floor as always, smiling. "Do you know what this is, Lila? It's a duck. Duck." He squeezed it gently. Squeak. The cheerful sound broke through the quiet air of the room. Lila stared at the duck. Her eyes shimmered, not with curiosity, but as if she were trying to remember something long forgotten. Noah squeezed it again. Squeak! "Duck," he repeated, softer this time. Maya, who was tidying up the room, stopped. Ethan stepped closer, sensing that something was about to happen. The room seemed to hold its breath. The afternoon light slanted through the window, laying a warm golden glow across Lila's face. And then her lips trembled. A faint, fragile sound escaped, like a breath awakening from a long sleep. Duck. It wasn't clear, it wasn't perfect, but it was everything. A sound that split open the silence of years. The room fell completely silent. Noah froze. Maya covered her mouth in shock. Ethan stood motionless, and then, as if the whole world had collapsed around him, he broke down and sobbed. It wasn't just a word. It was his daughter's first voice, her first word to the world. He knelt beside her, his hand shaking as he touched her tiny hand. Did you just speak? Lila, did you just say that?" Lila looked at him. Her eyes shone brighter than ever. Her lips moved again, but no sound came out. Yet no words were needed. They all understood. Noah clutched the duck tightly, tears streaming down his cheeks, but he was smiling. "I knew you could do it." From that day on, sound returned to the house, not the cold rhythm of machines, but the fragile, trembling, beautiful sounds of life. Water. Book. Noah. Short words, simple words, but to Ethan they were nothing short of miracles. Every time she spoke a new word, he wrote it down in his notebook: the date, the time, the weather, and how it made him feel. Maya hung Noah's drawings on the wall, and Lila would look at them, smiling, truly smiling, for the first time in her life. The silence that had reigned for so many years was finally broken, not by a cry or a shout, but by the smallest, most human sound in the world. One autumn morning, strong winds blew in from the sea, carrying the damp, salty scent of the ocean and the steady sound of waves crashing against the rocks. Maya went down to the basement to find tools to fix a window. The room was covered in dust, dim light filtering through a narrow crack, illuminating old cardboard boxes that had sat untouched for years. She was about to leave, but one box caught her attention. Its faded label read, "Medical, 2014. Maya bent down, brushed off the dust, and lifted the lid. Inside were thick stacks of medical files filled with signatures, hospital stamps, and blurred scan images. On every page was written the same name, Lila Cole. The more she read, the more her hands trembled. The first page, high-frequency neural stimulation therapy. The next, no response, increased sedative dosage. Then came a photo. Lila, only 4 years old, strapped to a metal chair, her eyes wide open and empty. Maya gasped. The words in front of her cut through her chest like knives: restraints, heavy sedatives, electric sound shocks, all authorized and signed by Ethan Cole. She sank onto the cold floor, clutching her head in her hands. She understood instantly. This wasn't just Lila's painful past. It was also the unbearable guilt of a father. That evening, Maya laid the stack of files on the dining table. Ethan had just entered when his gaze froze. Where did you find those? His voice came out rough, almost broken. In the basement, Maya replied, her eyes never leaving the papers. You signed all these orders, didn't you, Ethan? He stayed silent. Maya opened one of the photos, the one of Lila bound to the medical device. She went through all of this because you thought it would help her? Ethan stepped back, gripping the edge of the table, his breath faltering. I didn't know they went that far. They told me it was a new therapy. I only wanted to save her. I believed them. But you signed it? Maya said, her voice trembling. Ethan nodded, tears streaming down his face. I thought I was saving her, Ethan whispered, but I took away her soul instead, and I did it with the hands that should have protected her. He collapsed into a chair, shoulders shaking. Maya looked at him, her anger and compassion tangled in a single, painful knot. After a long silence, she spoke softly. We can't let this stay buried, not just for Lila, but for the other children out there. Ethan lifted his head. In his eyes there was pain, but for the first time there was also resolve. You're right. If I truly want redemption, I have to let the light shine on what I've hidden. The next day, Maya and Ethan contacted a human rights lawyer and an investigative journalist Maya had known from before. Together, they scanned every page, documented every piece of evidence, not for revenge, but to protect other children from the same nightmare. The news spread quickly. Reports, images, and buried memories surfaced like shards of glass rising from the sea floor. Ethan appeared on national television, his voice trembling but steady. I placed my faith in science and forgot about humanity. I don't want anyone else to repeat my mistake. The interview went viral. Hospitals and research centers were forced to review their procedures. Other parents began to speak out. A quiet wave of change began, one that started in the very house once suffocated by silence. Days later, Ethan sat on the porch, staring out at the sea. Maya brought him a cup of hot tea. He spoke softly. I used to build homes to let the light in, yet I let darkness take over my life. Thank you, Maya, for not leaving. She smiled gently, her eyes warm. Light never really disappears, Ethan. It just needs someone brave enough to open the door and let it back in. From then on, the house began to change. The curtains stayed open. Sunlight poured through every window. Laughter, Noah's and Lila's, echoed down the halls, filling every corner where silence once lived. Since the light had returned to their lives, the seaside house seemed to breathe differently. No longer filled with the cold hum of machines, it now echoed with the sound of waves, laughter, and sometimes the soft hum of Maya's voice as she sang quietly in the kitchen. One afternoon, Ethan stood before the abandoned room at the end of the hallway, the one that had once been packed with old medical equipment. Sunlight streamed through the dusty window, casting golden threads across the gray air. He smiled, feeling for the first time in years a desire to build something again. Not with blueprints, but with love. Ethan decided to turn that room into an art studio for Lila. They cleared everything out, the metal racks, bottles of medicine, cables, and old machines. Noah swept the floor, Maya cleaned the windows, and Ethan painted the walls a pure white. When the work was done, natural light poured in. Ethan placed a small wooden table by the window, a few paintbrushes, and a brand new watercolor set. That day, he said to his daughter, "From now on, you can speak in colors if you want to." Lila looked out the window where the sky met the sea in an endless blue line. She lifted a brush with her still weak hand and gently touched it to paper. The first color she chose was blue, the blue of water, of freedom, of the moment she first awakened in the cold pool. Each stroke was slow, uncertain, but alive. Every line of color was a word, every painting a conversation she had never been able to speak before. Noah sat beside her, not instructing, just watching. He began to draw too, sometimes a boat, sometimes a sun, sometimes a pair of open hands. They sat together for hours, silent yet deeply connected in their own way. Maya often stood quietly at the doorway, watching them. A gentle smile curved her lips, mingled with tears. She knew that Lila wasn't just painting pictures, she was painting her life back into being. One afternoon, Ethan entered the room carrying a wooden frame. He hung Lila's first painting on the wall, a large blue circle streaked with radiant yellow lines. He asked softly, "What will you call it?" Lila thought for a moment, then spoke slowly. "Alive." Ethan bowed his head, hiding the tear that escaped his eye. From that day on, new paintings began to appear all around the house, in the hallway, the dining room, the living room. Each one carried a piece of the girl's soul. The once sterile house now glowed like a living art gallery. Noah hung one of his drawings beside hers and wrote in small letters at the corner, "For us." Maya brewed tea. Ethan played soft classical music. They all sat together in the golden light of sunset, listening to the rhythm of the waves, blending with the laughter inside the house. From those awkward first conversations, Ethan and Maya began to truly talk. They spoke about the past, about loss, about fear, and about how both had chosen to stay anyway. Maya said quietly, "I used to think I could only exist, not truly live. But then I saw your daughter, and I realized that living means daring to believe one more time." Ethan looked at her and smiled. "Thank you for believing for me when I couldn't." In the fading light, they were no longer a master and a housekeeper, but two souls learning how to heal together. Noah and Lila still sat by the drawing table, laughing whenever new colors mixed in surprising, beautiful ways. The house was no longer a place that preserved pain. It had become a vast canvas where four hearts painted life anew. Years had passed since the seaside house became known as the House of Colors. Lila was now a young woman, taller, more confident, her eyes still carrying the deep blue of the sea. She still spoke slowly, but her voice was clear, gentle, like the breath of the wind. Her studio was filled with paintings, waves of blue, open arms, smiling faces. One morning, a letter arrived. It was an invitation to the National Conference on Children and Emotional Recovery. The organizers wanted Lila to share her journey, not as a patient, but as someone who had found her own voice. Ethan read the letter, his hands trembling. "Only if you feel ready," he said. Lila smiled and nodded. "I want to speak, not just for me, but for everyone." When the day came, the hall was full. Golden light fell on the stage where Lila stood beside Noah, wearing a simple blue dress, the color of freedom, the color of herself. She held the microphone and looked out at the silent audience. Maya and Ethan sat in the front row, holding hands. Lila took a deep breath and began, her voice slightly trembling, but warm. "When I was little, everyone said I would never speak. They tied wires, used drugs, machines, but no one truly listened to me. I stayed silent, not because I couldn't speak, but because no one spoke the language of the heart." She looked toward Noah, who smiled softly. Until one day, a boy walked into my room with a rubber duck and a smile. He didn't ask what was wrong with me. He just said, "Duck." And for the first time, I said it too. Duck. The audience laughed through their tears. Lila continued, "That was when I realized the world doesn't begin with noise, but with connection, with love, with the belief that inside every silence there's a voice waiting to be heard." Ethan bowed his head, tears streaming down his face. Maya squeezed his hand and whispered, "You did it." Lila ended her speech with a radiant smile. Today I can speak, paint, and sing, but the most important thing is that I am heard, and I hope every child who has ever forgotten will find their own voice too. Applause filled the hall, soft at first, then growing, rising, until it roared like waves. Ethan, Maya, and Noah stood together. When Lila stepped down from the stage, they embraced under the bright lights. No one said a word. They didn't need to. Lila's voice had not only saved her, it had healed everyone around her. In that moment, they were no longer fragments of an old tragedy. They were a family, whole, warm, and truly alive. After the conference, their lives were never the same. The door of the seaside house was always open. People came with stories, with gratitude, with tears. And yet, inside the house, peace remained. Lila kept painting, but not just for herself. She taught local children how to mix colors, how to see the world in light. Noah sat beside her, always the first to cheer when a child finished their first masterpiece. Ethan still designed, but no longer for big projects. Together with Maya, he opened a small studio in the garden where they taught architecture and art as two languages of kindness. They created spaces that breathed, where children could play, learn, and heal. One evening, as the sunset painted the sea crimson, Maya was arranging flowers on the porch. Ethan stepped out, holding a small wooden box. He smiled shyly, like a younger man. "Maya," he said softly, "I've built houses all my life, but now I just want to build one with you." She looked up, surprised, then smiled gently. "We already have one, Ethan," she whispered. "This house." He shook his head, stepped closer, and opened the box. Inside was a simple silver ring. "I want to call you mine, officially, not as a housekeeper, not as a partner, but as the woman I love, and the one who helps me raise these two amazing kids." Maya said nothing, just nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. Ethan held her hands tight, smiling like sunlight over the ocean. That night, the four of them, Ethan, Maya, Noah, and Lila, sat for dinner under the porch lights. The air smelled of salt and jasmine. Noah told a ridiculous story, making Lila burst into laughter. Maya leaned closer, her hand resting on Ethan's shoulder. There was no grand wedding, no guests, no speeches. Only four people who had once been broken, now whole under the same light. On the walls, Lila's paintings covered every space. The newest one hung in the center. 4 figures holding hands before a blue seaside house with a sky stretching endlessly behind them. At the bottom, she had written in her careful, slanted letters, "Home." Ethan looked up at it, eyes glistening. "That's the most beautiful design I've ever seen," he whispered. Maya smiled and squeezed his hand. "Because this time, we built it with our hearts, not our hands." Outside, the waves kept rolling. Inside, laughter mingled with the soft notes of Lila's piano. No more silence, no more fear. Only love, simple, complete, and real. That house no longer belonged only to them. It belonged to everyone who had ever been lost in pain. A symbol of rebirth, of voice, faith, and light returning to life. And in the final glow of sunset, as the four of them sat together, one truth became clear. Family isn't made by blood, it's built by love, steady, patient, unconditional.